Let's face it, whether we want to admit it or not, we're all like the Ferengi. We love money. Who loves money more than us, though? Billionaires? Well, yes, but think grander scale. Governments? Sure, but a bit smaller scale than that. In this case, it'd be corporations. Plus, let's face it, Atlus is a huge corporation, part of a much larger one in Sega. So, Sega and Atlus will of course want to make as much profit as possible. How can they do that, though? As they can't keep milling Persona 4 and Persona 5 forever. The company also probably doesn't want to make too many new IPs, as new intellectual properties come at a greater risk of failure. And when it comes to big budget video games, failures are more costly than ever with how the industry is changing. A lot of people would say Atlus have already milked the topic of this video to death. You have Persona 3, Persona 3 FES, Persona 3 Portable, and there's probably some spin-off titles I can't think of offhand. A lot of hardcore Atlus fans are already upset over the decision to remove broken social links and by making the reverse mechanic less damaging. In a previous video, I covered why this is a good idea. Go check that one out when you're done with this one. But that's beside my point. My point is, Atlus knows they have a money maker on their hands with Persona 3 Reload, despite the backlash. I'd argue it's actually quite likely they will at some point make a definitive version of Persona 3 Reload. Maybe call it Persona 3 Reload FES or Persona 3 Reload Azure. Either way, whatever its nomenclature ends up being, that does not matter. What does matter is the game will likely get an updated version, so why do I think it'll get an updated version? Let's get into that now. I've already touched on one of my points as to why I think this game will eventually get yet another iteration. It comes down to Atlus knows they can make money from it, even if a lot of Persona fans would like to see either Persona 1 remade or the Persona duology. Atlus deliberately removing elements of the FES storyline whilst also keeping others and omitting the female main character might be a little anti-consumer, but from a marketing standpoint, it's actually an incredibly smart business choice by Atlus. They know their core fanbase will buy the game no matter what. They also know the more casual fans will buy the base version to experience P3 with a modern coat of paint. Atlus have been doing this for a long time now. Release a more basic version, and then a couple years later release the definitive edition. Persona 3 is just an outlier for some reason, since the vanilla version released in 2006 on PS2 in Japan, 2007 for North America, and 2008 for the rest of the world. FES came 1 year later in Japan and released in 2008 for the rest of the world. P3 Portable came out in 2009 in Japan for the PSP, then came out in 2010 and 2011 for the rest of the world respectively. Portable sort of made sense as the PSP, despite aging a little bit by this point, needed more games, and it had a large install base. Plus, for whatever reason, RPGs are just great on handheld consoles. So Atlus, if they do decide to do a definitive version of P3, will just be following up on their history of releasing additional iterations of their titles. Also, if they do make a definitive version, they'll bring back some of the fanbase who currently feel jilted either from the removal of mechanics, story elements, or FemMC. I don't particularly like this business model, but I can at least understand it. Do you think this is likely though? Let me know in the comments. Another reason I think they might go this route is because we still have no news on Persona 6. I have speculated in the past as to when we might see it, and I think the Game Awards is the most likely, even if Tokyo Game Show would have been a more fitting event. If Persona 6 is still a good ways off, this is a perfect opportunity for Atlus to buy some time. Also, whilst they're buying said time, they can experiment with mechanics in a definitive version of Persona 3 Reload. Also, if you look at how Atlus does things, Persona 3 was a more refined version of what came before. Persona 4 built off what worked with Persona 3 FES and Portable, and then Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal iterated on that idea to the nth degree. I imagine Atlus might shadow drop some mechanics we could see in Persona 6. Which is hard to imagine, as Persona 5 was already packed to the gills with mechanics. The only thing I'd like to see them do is something akin to Brave Orders from the Trails series. Then again, my being unable to come up with a brand new mechanic is part of why I'm doing YouTube and not, game design. If you have any ideas as to what new mechanics you'd like to see in a definitive edition of Persona 3, do let me know, and do let me know some you'd like to see added to Persona 6. Moving on to my third point though, I feel like at some point Atlus is going to have to make a definitive version of this game. As it stands right now, having it all piecemeal like that is fracturing the player base. A fractured player base is never a good thing. Look at what happens when Sega fractures its supposed cornerstone property Sonic. That fracture is so large that Sonic fans of various eras tend to not get along. For example, I'm a fan of the 2D era games. Fans from the 3D era tend to pick fights with us Sonic boomers. Then there are those fans who love the Hedgehog engine. Also, look at Crash and Spyro fanbases. They're divided on what future versions of those series should look like. Fans of the PS2 era Crash games want that franchise to return to the semi-open world level design made famous by Twinsanity. Fans of the Mutant titles want a 3D collectathon beat-em-up. Then the original fans want Crash to remain a linear 3D Holloway platformer. Spyro fans, thankfully, are only divided on if they want the game to be semi-open world 3D collectathon platformers or 3D beat-em-ups. Thankfully, no one wants a return of the Skylanders formula. But getting back to Persona 3, the fanbase is incredibly fractured, even though the core of the game remains the same. Most people want the female protagonist added, and everyone universally wants the entirety of FES included in the continuity. Whilst it isn't as toxic as the divide in the aforementioned communities, having schisms leads to an us versus them mentality within fanbases, which is not a good thing. By doing this, Atlus ensures they keep the fanbase happy for the most part, all while improving their profit margins, which ultimately ensures we get more Persona content, which makes me happy as I love the Persona games. Also, if the Persona games are doing well, that gives Atlus more capital to attempt more experimental titles. If those experimental titles bomb, it's fine. They were just experiments, and if they take off, that gives Atlus more potential revenue streams. By making a definitive version, Atlus ensures the fanbase is happy. My fourth reason for believing Atlus will make an ultimate version of Persona 3 is because they know the fanbase is demanding it. If it doesn't live up to those expectations, they are going to have a ton of very upset fans, and an upset fanbase is bad for profit margins, which hurts not just Atlus, but Sega as well. If Sega ends up hurting, that means less money to go around to not just Atlus, but other developers and projects. Less money going around means fewer resources to invest in ensuring other games are as good and as polished as they can be. If the quality of your project doesn't meet expectations, you then get a situation akin to Cyberpunk 2077. Glitched out messes that barely function on launch, which has a knockdown effect of pissing off more consumers, which leads to less trust in that company, which can then lead to serious situations like the video game crash of the 80s. So those were my 4 reasons as to why I think Atlus will make yet another version of Persona 3. What do you think though? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. 2 of my previous videos will be popping up now, and they just happen to be Persona 3 related. Why not check them out? Until next time, keep blazing that trail.